The Blackwater Stories, Episode 1. Rain Across Blackwater Harbour. Chapter 1. The evening rain arrived slowly over Blackwater Harbour. Not as a storm, not at first, but as a fine silver mist drifting across the estuary from somewhere beyond the darkening water. The last warmth of the day still lingered faintly in the old harbour walls. The stone pathways remained warm beneath the damp air, carrying the smell of rainwater, sea salt, and weathered timber from the moored boats below. Along the waterfront, lamps were beginning to glow one by one behind rain-speckled windows. The tea rooms near the ferry steps had already closed for the evening. Their painted wooden signs creaked softly in the breeze, while folded chairs sat stacked beneath striped awnings that fluttered gently against the gathering weather. Somewhere farther along the harbour, a buoy bell rang once through the mist, slow, hollow, comfortingly distant. Elias Mercer paused beneath the overhang of an old chandlery shop and looked out across the estuary. The tide was almost full now. Dark water shifted lazily against the harbour wall below him, carrying wavering reflections from the lamps behind the promenade railings. He pulled the collar of his coat slightly higher, more from habit than necessity. Even in summer, evenings beside the estuary could cool quickly once the rain arrived. For a while he simply stood there listening. Rain tapped softly against canvas boat covers. Water dripped steadily from rusted chains beside the slipway. Farther out in the mist, somewhere near Gull Point perhaps, came the low murmur of a boat engine returning slowly through the channel. Blackwater Harbour always sounded different in rain. During bright afternoons, the waterfront belonged to gulls, footsteps, voices, and clattering crockery from the cafes overlooking the tide. But rainy evenings were quieter. The harbour seemed to settle into itself somehow, as though the whole town relaxed once the visitors disappeared indoors and the weather reclaimed the shoreline again. Elias had always preferred it that way. He began walking slowly along the harbour path, passing shuttered gift shops and old brick storehouses blackened by decades of salt air and winter storms. Light spilled warmly from the windows of the Saltwind Inn farther ahead. That familiar golden glow reflected across the wet pavement in long, trembling streaks. A few quiet figures sat inside near the windows, their faces softened by lamplight and rain-blurred glass. Someone laughed gently near the fireplace. Elias smiled faintly to himself. There was comfort in places that never hurried, places where clocks ticked softly, where conversations drifted lazily beside old wooden tables, where rain against the windows seemed almost part of the building itself. He continued farther along the harbour wall until the buildings began to thin and the marsh paths opened beyond the final row of cottages. Out there, the estuary widened into reeds and open water. Mist moved slowly above the marsh grasses. The distant lantern at Gull Point blinked steadily through the rain. Elias rested both hands on the damp railings and breathed in the cool evening air. Somewhere behind him, hidden now by drizzle and gathering darkness, the bell above the inn door opened and closed. Footsteps crossed the pavement briefly, then faded away again. The rain became slightly heavier, not harsh, not unpleasant, just steady summer rain sweeping quietly across the harbour. Elias watched it drifting over the estuary in silver bands. and for the first time all day, the harbour finally felt calm. Chapter 2. The rain continued for most of the evening, not heavy enough to drive anyone into shelter completely, but steady enough that the harbour slowly emptied until only a few scattered figures remained moving through the mist beside the water. Elias walked on at an unhurried pace. The old harbour wall curved gently ahead of him, following the shape of the estuary towards the darker reaches of Greywater Marsh. Beyond the railings, fishing boats rocked softly against their ropes. Water tapped against their hulls with a slow, hollow rhythm that echoed beneath the stone promenade. Now and then, rainwater dripped from Elias's coat collar onto the pavement below. He did not mind. There were some evenings that seemed improved by rain. This was one of them. Halfway along the harbour wall stood a small covered shelter with weathered green paint and fogged glass panels facing the water. Years ago it had been used by ferry passengers waiting for the tidewatch crossing before the old route closed. Now it mostly sheltered gulls and the occasional tired walker caught in bad weather. Warm yellow light glowed faintly inside. Elias slowed slightly. Through the misted glass he could see someone sitting on the wooden bench within the shelter, holding a steaming paper cup between both hands. As he approached, the figure looked up. "Evening, Elias." "Evening, Nora." Nora Bellamy ran the little tea room near the ferry steps during the daytime. In the evenings, she often walked the harbour after closing, usually carrying tea strong enough to wake half the estuary. She lifted the spare cup resting beside her. "Thought I might see you eventually." Elias stepped into the shelter out of the rain. The roof rattled softly beneath the steady drizzle overhead. Outside, harbour lamps glimmered through the wet darkness like distant lanterns floating above the tide. "You always know when rain's coming before anyone else," Nora said. "My knees know before I do. That still counts." She handed him the second cup. The tea was hot and strong and smelled faintly of cinnamon. "You've put something in this." "Small amount of brandy." "That explains why it smells optimistic." Nora smiled quietly into her cup. For a while they sat listening to the rain. The shelter amplified every small harbour sound. Water running from gutters, ropes creaking, a gull complaining somewhere unseen beyond the mist. Farther out across the estuary came the low, mournful call of a foghorn drifting from the outer channel. Long, soft, almost sleepy. Nora leaned back against the bench. "Tourists hate this weather," she said. "Do they?" "They come looking for sunsets and postcards. And instead they find damp benches and seagulls stealing chips." "Exactly." Elias watched rain moving across the harbour lights. "I think places become more themselves in weather like this." Nora nodded slowly. "Yes, I think that's true." The foghorn sounded again. The sound rolled softly across the marsh water before fading into the rain. Nora lowered her voice slightly. "Did you hear about the lantern?" Elias glanced across at her. "No." "Light came on at Gull Point last night." Elias frowned faintly. "The old lantern tower?" Nora nodded. "But nobody uses it anymore." "No one's supposed to." Outside, rainwater streamed down the shelter windows in silver ribbons. Elias looked out towards the distant darkness where Gull Point lay hidden behind the mist, far beyond the reeds, beyond the harbour mouth, somewhere near the outer marsh channel. "What time?" he asked. "Just after midnight, apparently." "And who saw it?" "Half the fishermen leaving early this morning." Elias remained quiet for a moment. Then he took another sip of tea. The warmth settled pleasantly against the cold, damp air. "Probably reflection from the lighthouse," he said eventually. "Probably." But Nora did not sound convinced. The rain softened slightly after a while, becoming finer, gentler, drifting almost sideways now through the harbour lamps. Nora stood and pulled her coat tighter. "Well," she said softly, "I'd better get home before the weather changes its mind again." "It usually does." She smiled, then paused near the shelter entrance. "If you walk as far as the marsh path tonight—" She glanced towards the estuary. "Look across towards Gull Point." "Why?" Nora looked out into the drifting mist. "Just to see whether the lantern appears again." Then she disappeared slowly into the rainy darkness beside the harbour wall, leaving Elias alone beneath the shelter roof with the fading smell of cinnamon tea and the soft, endless sound of summer rain moving across Blackwater Harbour. Chapter 3. Elias remained in the old ferry shelter for a little while after Nora left. The rain had eased again now, becoming little more than drifting silver mist moving quietly across the harbour lamps and marsh water. He finished the last of the tea slowly. Outside, the estuary seemed suspended between weather and darkness. The tide had reached its highest point, pressing softly against the harbour wall below with slow, heavy movements that sounded almost like breathing. For a moment, everything was still. No footsteps, no voices, only the distant creak of boats and the occasional hollow tap of water beneath the quay. Then, far across the marshes, a light appeared. Elias looked up immediately. It was faint at first, just a small amber glow somewhere beyond the harbour mouth near Gull Point, the old lantern tower. He narrowed his eyes slightly. The light flickered once through the mist, disappeared briefly, then returned again. Steady this time, not bright like the lighthouse beam farther out to sea. Warmer, lower, almost old-fashioned. Elias set the empty paper cup beside him and stepped out from the shelter into the damp evening air. Rain settled lightly against his coat as he rested both hands on the harbour railings. The lantern glow remained visible beyond the reeds, soft and distant. Years ago, before the automated lighthouse system had been installed along the outer coast, Gull Point had carried a smaller warning lantern for fishing boats entering the marsh channels during fog. But the old tower had supposedly been abandoned for decades, at least officially. Elias watched the light carefully. There was nothing threatening about it. If anything, it felt strangely comforting, like seeing a lamp burning in the window of a distant cottage late at night. Behind him, somewhere back along the harbour front, a door opened briefly and released warm music into the rain before closing again. The harbour inn, most likely. The faint sound drifted across the wet pavement and vanished into the mist. Elias remained where he was. The lantern glow blinked softly once more. Then the rain thickened suddenly across the estuary, sweeping between him and Gull Point in long silver curtains. By the time it passed, the light had gone. He stood there another minute or two. Nothing returned, only darkness beyond the marshes now, and the slow turning beam of the distant lighthouse farther out along the coast. Eventually, Elias turned away from the railings and continued walking towards the marsh path. The promenade lamps became fewer there. Soon, only occasional pools of yellow light remained behind him, while the estuary opened wider on either side. Grey-water marsh stretched quietly into darkness beneath the rainy sky. Even in summer, the marshes carried their own kind of weather. Mist gathered there more quickly. Sounds travelled strangely, and distances often appeared farther away than they truly were. The narrow path wound between tall reeds that whispered softly together whenever the breeze shifted across the water. Elias knew the route well. He had walked it in rain, frost, summer fog, and winter storms powerful enough to shake the harbour windows for miles along the estuary. But tonight the marshes felt unusually calm, as though the rain itself had softened the whole landscape into silence. After 10 minutes he reached the old tide marker. It stood beside the path, leaning slightly towards the water, its faded measurements barely visible beneath years of salt and weather. Someone had left fresh wildflowers there, small white sea asters tied loosely with blue ribbon. Elias stopped. There was no note attached, no explanation, just flowers glistening quietly with rain beneath the lonely marsh lamp overhead. He looked out across the estuary again. Nothing moved now except drifting rain and the dark, restless tide. Still, he could not quite shake the feeling that someone had been there only moments earlier, watching the water, waiting for the lantern, or perhaps simply listening to the marshes breathe beneath the rain. Elias adjusted his coat collar once more and continued slowly along the path. Behind him, unseen now in the mist and darkness, the old lantern at Gull Point remained unlit, at least for the moment. Chapter 4. The marsh path narrowed as Elias walked on. On either side of him, tall reeds rose shoulder-high, their pale heads bending gently beneath the soft weight of rain. Water gathered in shining beads along each blade, then slipped down into the dark channels below with faint, delicate ticks. The harbour lights were behind him now. Ahead there was only the low sweep of Greywater Marsh, the open estuary, and the unseen curve of Gull Point somewhere beyond the drifting mist. Elias moved slowly. He knew better than to hurry on marsh paths after rain. The ground could look firm and still shift beneath a careless step. The old boards along the wettest stretches could become slick as glass. And in weather like this, distances lost their certainty. A lantern that seemed close could be half a mile away. A voice could travel across water from places you could not see. After a while, the path lifted onto a narrow ridge of firmer ground. There, half hidden behind tamarisk and long grass, stood an old wooden hut. The Tide Watch hut. Its roof sagged slightly on one side, and the paint had worn away almost entirely from the door. Once, harbourmen had used it to record water levels, storm warnings, and boat movements through the marsh channel. Now it mostly held dust, spiders, and memories. Elias still had a key. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell was exactly as he remembered. old timber, salt, damp paper, cold iron. He found the small lamp on the shelf, checked the oil, then lit it with a match. Warm light spread across the hut, touching the narrow table, the rusted stove, the tide charts pinned to the wall, and the old logbook still lying where he had left it months before. Rain whispered against the roof. Elias sat on the wooden chair by the window and looked out across the marsh. From here, Gull Point was usually visible. Tonight, there was only mist. He opened the logbook. The last entry was his own, written in early spring. High tide calm, wind east, marsh clear, no vessels after dusk. He turned back through the pages. Years of weather lived there. Storms, fog, moonlit tides, summer heat, winter frost, names of boats long gone. Men and women who had worked the harbour crossed the marsh, waited for the tide, and walked home through weather no one else remembered. Then, near the back of the book, Elias found a loose note tucked between two pages. The paper was old and folded twice. On it, in faded blue ink, someone had written, "When the rain comes warm from the south, leave a light at Gull Point." Elias read the line once, then again. Outside, rain tapped steadily on the window. He did not recognize the handwriting, but he recognized the feeling of the words. They sounded like the harbour itself, practical, gentle, a little mysterious. He folded the note carefully and placed it back where he had found it. For several minutes he sat without moving, listening to the rain soften the roof above him. Then, through the mist beyond the window, the amber light appeared again, faint, low, steady, the lantern at Gull Point. Elias rose slowly from the chair. This time the light did not vanish. It burned quietly in the distance as if waiting for him to notice. He turned down the lamp inside the hut, locked the door behind him, and stepped back onto the marsh path. The rain was warmer now. The tide was full, and ahead, beyond the reeds and silver mist, the old lantern glowed softly at the edge of the sleeping estuary. Chapter 5. The path towards Gull Point curved gently along the edge of the estuary. Rain drifted across the marshes in fine silver sheets now, soft enough that Elias could still hear the water moving quietly below the reeds. The lantern remained visible ahead of him, not bright, not dramatic, simply steady. A warm amber glow resting somewhere within the mist beyond the shoreline. Elias walked carefully over the damp boards crossing the narrow tidal channels. Water moved silently beneath them, carrying reflections of rain and sky together in blurred ribbons of silver grey. Somewhere out on the estuary, a bird called once through the darkness. Then everything became quiet again. The farther Elias moved from Blackwater Harbour, the more the world seemed to simplify itself. There were no engines here, no radios, no distant traffic, only weather, water, and the slow, patient breathing of the tide. At last the path widened slightly as it reached the outer edge of Gull Point. The lantern tower stood there at the very tip of the marsh headland, small, round, built from dark stone blackened by decades of salt wind and rain. The old warning lantern still glowed inside the upper window. Elias stopped for a moment beneath the drizzle. He had not stood this close to the tower in years. grass moved softly around the stones. Rainwater trickled down grooves worn deep into the old masonry. The wooden door stood slightly open. Warm light spilled faintly onto the wet ground outside. Elias approached slowly and rested one hand against the damp timber. Inside, someone was humming very quietly. Not singing exactly, just the absent-minded hum of someone comfortable being alone. Elias knocked gently against the door. The humming stopped. Then a voice called from within. "You may as well come in. The rain's not improving." Elias stepped inside. The lantern room was smaller than he remembered. Round walls curved around a narrow wooden table, a kettle, 2 chairs, shelves of old charts, and a small iron stove glowing softly with heat. Rain tapped steadily against the thick glass lantern panes overhead. And beside the stove sat an elderly woman wrapped in a heavy blue cardigan, calmly pouring tea into 2 mismatched mugs. She looked up at Elias without surprise. "You took your time," she said. Elias blinked once. "I beg your pardon. I lit the lantern nearly half an hour ago." The woman pushed the second mug gently across the table. "Sit down before you drip on everything." Elias removed his coat and sat opposite her. The room smelled warmly of tea leaves, stove smoke, damp wool, and rain-soaked timber. Outside, mist moved around the tower glass like pale smoke. "You're wondering who I am," the woman said. "I confess the thought has crossed my mind. Rose Winter." The name settled somewhere in Elias's memory, not fully remembered, but familiar. "You used to work the ferries," he said slowly. Rose nodded. "My husband did. I kept the lantern records." Elias looked upwards towards the glowing light overhead. "I thought this tower had been abandoned." "It mostly has." "Then why light it?" Rose stirred her tea quietly. "Because warm rain confuses the outer channel." Elias waited. "Not for modern boats," she added. "They've all got screens and radar, and machines telling them where they are. But smaller boats still lose their bearings sometimes in marsh fog." Outside, rain drifted across the lantern glass in silver threads. "The harbour doesn't officially use this light anymore," Elias said. Rose smiled faintly. "No, but marshes rarely care about official decisions." The kettle ticked softly on the stove beside them. For several moments neither spoke. There was something deeply calming about the lantern room. The circular walls, the steady rain, the soft turning glow above them. It felt separate from ordinary time somehow, as though weather moved differently there. At last Rose looked across at him carefully. "You've been away from Blackwater too long." Elias smiled slightly into his tea. "That obvious? You still walk like someone listening for trains." Outside, somewhere far below the tower, tide water moved slowly through the reeds beneath the warm summer rain. And above it all, the old Gull Point lantern continued burning steadily into the mist, keeping quiet company with the sleeping estuary beyond. Chapter 6. The rain deepened as the evening wore on, not violently, just steadily, patiently, until the whole lantern tower seemed wrapped inside weather and warm light together. Elias sat beside the stove while Rose Winter refilled the teapot. Outside the thick lantern glass, the estuary had almost vanished now beneath drifting rain and mist. Only occasional reflections from the harbour far behind them shimmered faintly through the darkness. Everything else belonged to the weather. "You still keep records?" Elias asked, glancing towards the shelves beside the wall. Rose followed his gaze. Stacked there were narrow black notebooks tied with faded string. Dates had been written carefully across each spine in white ink. "Some habits stay put," she said quietly. She handed him one of the books. The pages smelled faintly of salt and old paper. Inside were neat entries written in careful handwriting. Heavy fog after midnight. Tide unusually quiet. Warm rain from southwest. Lantern visible as far as the outer reeds. 2 fishing boats returned late. Both claimed they saw harbour lights before the harbour itself. Elias turned another page. There were no dramatic stories, no disasters, only weather, tides, small observations gathered patiently over years. Yet somehow the book felt comforting, like proof that someone had always been awake while the estuary slept. Rose noticed him smiling slightly. Most people think keeping records sounds dull. They're wrong. "Yes," she said. "Usually they are." Rainwater trickled steadily down the outer tower windows. The lantern above them rotated softly, casting warm amber movements across the ceiling every few seconds. Elias leaned back slightly in the chair. "When did you start lighting the lantern again?" Rose took a little time answering. "Last winter." "Why?" She looked towards the marshes beyond the glass. "Too many dark evenings." The answer sounded simple, but not complete. Elias waited quietly. Eventually, Rose spoke again. "My husband used to say the estuary disliked being abandoned." "The estuary?" She smiled faintly at the expression on Elias's face. "You've lived near marshes long enough to know places develop moods." "That's true. The harbour changes in fog. The tide sounds different before storms. And some nights..." She glanced upwards towards the lantern. "The outer marshes feel less lonely when there's a light burning here." The stove crackled softly beside them. For a while, Elias listened to the rain moving across the tower roof. He realized then how tired he had been before returning to Blackwater Harbour. Not physically tired. Something quieter than that. The kind of tiredness that gathered slowly over years, spent rushing between places that never truly asked a person to stay. But here, inside the lantern tower, with rain surrounding the estuary and warm light turning slowly overhead, the tiredness seemed to loosen slightly, not disappear, just soften. Rose poured the last of the tea. "You know," she said, "people used to wait for weather." Elias looked up. "What do you mean?" "Before everything became instant, before screens and schedules and rushing about. Rain used to stop people. Fog used to delay them. Storms made people stay indoors and talk to each other." Elias nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now everyone becomes annoyed when the world behaves like weather." He laughed quietly at that. Outside, Somewhere beyond the tower, a buoy bell sounded through the mist. Low, distant, comfortingly lonely. Rose stood slowly from her chair and adjusted the lantern controls with practiced hands. The warm beam brightened slightly above them. "Best keep her strong tonight," she murmured. "She?" "The lantern." "You talk to it?" "Of course." Elias smiled again. The rain softened at last after midnight, not stopping completely, just easing into a gentler drifting sound against the glass. Rose moved towards the narrow doorway and looked out across the sleeping marshes. "You should head back before the tide turns," she said. Elias stood and collected his coat. Outside, the mist had thinned enough for him to see the faint glow of Blackwater Harbour far across the estuary, tiny golden reflections trembling against the dark water. "Will the lantern still be here tomorrow night?" he asked. Rose looked up towards the warm turning light overhead. "Oh yes," she said softly. Then she smiled towards the rainy darkness beyond Gull Point. Somebody ought to keep company with the marshes. Chapter 7. The tide had begun to turn by the time Elias left Gull Point. Rain still drifted lightly across the estuary, though the heavier weather had finally passed eastward beyond the outer marshes. Behind him, the lantern tower glowed warmly through the mist. Ahead, the narrow path back towards Blackwater Harbour shimmered faintly beneath scattered pools of rainwater and pale reflections from the cloud-covered sky. Elias walked slowly. The marshes always felt different after midnight, quieter somehow, as though the estuary itself had fallen half asleep. Water moved softly through hidden channels beneath the reeds. Tiny droplets gathered on the marsh grass and silvered the edges of the path. Somewhere far out near the tide flats, unseen birds shifted quietly in the darkness, and above everything hung the low, endless sound of water breathing against the land. Halfway back along the ridge path, Elias stopped beside the old tide marker once again. The flowers beneath the lamp remained there. Rain darkened now, their pale petals shining faintly beneath the weak yellow glow overhead. But this time, something else rested beside them. A small blue enamel tin. Elias frowned slightly. He bent down and lifted the lid carefully. Inside were shortbread biscuits wrapped in wax paper. Still fresh, still dry. A folded note rested on top. Elias unfolded it slowly beneath the lamp. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. For anyone walking home in weather, nothing more. No name. No explanation. Elias smiled quietly to himself. That, he thought, was exactly the sort of thing Blackwater Harbour would do. He replaced the lid carefully and slipped the tin beneath his coat. Rain ticked softly against the marsh lamp overhead. Far behind him, the Gull Point lantern continued turning steadily through the mist. When Elias finally reached the harbour promenade again, the village had become almost completely silent. Most windows were dark now. Only the harbour inn still showed light behind its rain-blurred glass. As he approached, the door opened briefly and Noel the landlord appeared carrying a crate of empty bottles. He spotted Elias immediately. "You look damp," Noel observed. "Insightful as ever." "Lantern showing tonight." Elias paused slightly. "You know about that too?" Noel snorted softly. In Blackwater. Everyone knows eventually. He lowered the crate beside the doorway and looked out towards the estuary. My grandfather used to say the lantern meant the harbour was still awake. Even after the ferries stopped, especially after the ferries stopped. Rainwater dripped steadily from the inn roof beside them. The smell of warm wood smoke drifted out through the open doorway. Noel glanced towards the blue tin beneath Elias's coat. She gave you biscuits. You know who left them? Probably half the village. Elias laughed quietly. That doesn't narrow it down. No, that's the beauty of it. From somewhere inside the inn came the faint sound of a piano being played very badly and very slowly. Noel winced slightly. Barry's still practicing. At this hour? He claims rain improves his timing. Does it? No. Elias stood beneath the awning for another minute, listening to the rain and distant piano drifting softly across the sleeping harbour. Then Noel nodded towards the estuary. You heading home? Home. The word settled gently somewhere inside Elias. He looked along the harbour wall. The rain-darkened stone. The quiet lamps reflected in the tidewater. The sleeping boats rocking softly against their ropes. Then he looked back towards the warm windows of the inn, and beyond them, somewhere hidden now by mist and darkness, the faint turning glow of Gull Point lantern. Yes, he said eventually. I think I am. Noel gave a small, satisfied nod as though this confirmed something important. Then he carried the empty bottles back inside, leaving Elias alone once more beside the rainy harbour. For a little while longer, Elias remained there, listening to the estuary breathe beneath the warm summer rain. Then at last, he turned up the narrow lane towards the small apartment above the chandlery shop. Carrying the blue tin beneath his coat, while the old lantern continued keeping watch over Blackwater Harbour far into the sleeping night. Chapter 8. Elias woke later than usual the next morning. Soft grey light filled the room above the chandlery, and for several quiet seconds he simply lay listening to the rainwater still dripping outside from gutters and window ledges after the night's weather. The storm had passed, but the harbour remained wrapped in that gentle, washed silence that often follows warm summer rain. Somewhere below, a gull landed heavily on the cobbled lane and immediately began complaining about something. Elias smiled faintly. Blackwater Harbour was awake again. He dressed slowly and opened the small kitchen window overlooking the waterfront. Fresh, damp air drifted inside, carrying the smell of salt water, wet timber, and bread baking somewhere nearby. The tide was low now. Fishing boats rested crookedly against the harbour mud, while thin silver streams wound lazily between the exposed sandbanks beyond the quay. Harbour workers were already moving about below in waterproof coats, rolling ropes and checking nets while the morning remained cool and overcast. Farther out, beyond the estuary mouth, the lighthouse beam had disappeared completely into daylight. But the memory of the lantern at Gull Point still lingered quietly in Elias's thoughts. He boiled water for tea. Then he opened the blue enamel tin. Inside, beneath the remaining shortbread biscuits, he noticed something he had missed during the night. Another folded piece of paper. Smaller this time. Elias unfolded it carefully beside the steaming kettle. The note read, "The lantern keeps better company than silence does. No signature, only those words. He read them twice, then once more. Outside, rainwater dripped steadily from the harbour railings below. The note felt oddly familiar somehow, not because he recognized the handwriting, but because he understood the feeling behind it immediately. Some places did become too quiet once abandoned, some rooms, some buildings, even some people. Elias placed the note carefully beside the window, while the kettle rattled softly on the stove. By mid-morning, the harbour had brightened considerably. Clouds broke apart over the estuary, allowing pale shafts of sunlight to move slowly across the marsh water in great drifting patches of silver and blue. The promenade began filling again with ordinary life. Visitors carrying umbrellas they no longer needed, children dragging crab buckets, cyclists stopping beside the harbour wall to remove waterproof jackets. From the open door of Nora Bellamy's tea room came the smell of toasted bread and fresh coffee. As Elias passed, Nora leaned out from behind the counter. "You saw it then?" "The lantern?" She nodded. Elias stepped inside the tea room. Warmth immediately wrapped around him. Windows fogged softly from kettles and cooking. Rain-darkened postcards curled slightly near the till. Along one shelf sat jars of homemade marmalade glowing amber in the returning sunlight. Nora placed a mug of tea in front of him before he even sat down. "You knew Rose was there," Elias said. "Of course. You might have warned me." Nora stirred sugar slowly into her own cup. "And ruin the mystery." Elias looked out through the steamed window towards the harbour. "I thought the tower had been abandoned." "So did most people." "But not you." "No." Outside, sunlight flashed briefly across the wet harbour stones. Nora lowered her voice slightly. "Rose has been lighting Gull Point on rainy nights since last winter." "Why only rainy nights?" Nora smiled faintly. "Because rainy nights are when people feel alone most easily." The answer stayed with Elias for a while. A customer entered carrying a damp newspaper, and Nora disappeared briefly towards the counter. Elias sat quietly beside the window, watching Blackwater Harbour return to its ordinary daytime rhythm. Boats shifting gently with the tide, gulls circling lazily above the quay, sunlight appearing and disappearing behind slow-moving clouds. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. Yet beneath the ordinary life of the harbour now, he sensed something else quietly moving. A kind of unspoken understanding shared among the people who remained here year after year. The lantern, the marshes, the tide marker flowers, the biscuits left for strangers walking home in rain. Small acts of quiet company. Outside, beyond the harbour mouth, the estuary widened into pale summer light, and somewhere far across the marshes at Gull Point, the old lantern tower waited patiently for evening to return once more. Chapter 9. By late afternoon, the weather changed again. The brief brightness of the morning faded slowly beneath thickening cloud drifting inland from the estuary. Sunlight disappeared from the harbour roofs one by one until the whole waterfront settled back into soft grey tones and silver reflections. Elias noticed the change immediately. Blackwater Harbour always seemed to pause slightly before rain arrived. Voices lowered. Gulls disappeared from the rooftops. Even the tide seemed to move more quietly against the harbour wall. He closed the door of the chandlery shop behind him and began walking towards the promenade just as the first drops touched the pavement. Warm rain again, gentle at first, almost pleasant. The harbour lamps had not yet come on, but already the wet stone pathways reflected the fading evening sky in long pale streaks. A few people hurried along the waterfront carrying coats over their heads. Others simply accepted the weather and continued walking slowly through it. Blackwater had always contained people who understood rain properly. At the far end of the promenade, near the old ferry shelter, Elias found Finn sitting on the bench beneath the roof with a paper parcel balanced on his knees. "You'll get soaked out there," Elias said. Finn shrugged. "I'm waiting for the proper rain." "The proper rain?" "This is only the beginning." Elias sat beside him. The harbour stretched quietly before them beneath the darkening sky. Beyond the estuary mouth, mist had already begun gathering across Greywater Marsh. Finn opened the paper parcel carefully. Inside were 2 thick slices of buttered fruit loaf. "Gran made too much again," he explained. "That happens remarkably often. She says weather makes people hungry." Finn handed him 1 slice. Rain tapped softly against the shelter roof above them. For several minutes they ate quietly while the harbour darkened. Then Finn asked, "Did you go to Gull Point?" Elias glanced sideways at him. "What makes you think that?" "You smell like lantern oil." Elias laughed softly. "That's either very observant or deeply worrying." Finn looked pleased with himself. "Did you meet Rose?" "Yes." "What's she like?" "Calm." Finn nodded as though this confirmed his expectations. "She used to help my dad when his boat came in late." "Did she?" "She always left the lantern burning longer than she was supposed to." Rain drifted heavier now across the harbour. The estuary beyond the shelter faded gradually into darkness and silver mist. Finn lowered his voice slightly. "Dad says some people think the lantern isn't really for boats anymore." "What do they think it's for?" Finn considered carefully. "Lonely people." The answer arrived so simply that Elias did not speak for a moment. Outside, rainwater streamed from the shelter roof in bright ribbons beneath the first harbour lamps flickering into life. At last, Elias asked quietly, "And what do you think?" Finn watched the estuary. "I think places can feel lonely too." The rain strengthened suddenly then, sweeping hard across the harbour in great silver waves. People disappeared indoors almost immediately. Windows glowed warmly along the promenade. The harbour inn lamps brightened against the weather. Far across the estuary, through drifting rain and darkness, the Gull Point lantern appeared once again. Warm, steady, waiting. Finn smiled faintly when he saw it. "There," he said quietly. For a while, neither of them moved. The rain drummed steadily overhead. The lantern burned softly beyond the marshes, and Blackwater Harbour settled slowly into another long, rainy evening beside the tide. Chapter 10. The rain continued well into the evening. By 8 o'clock, the harbour front had become a world of reflections and soft, blurred light. Water shone across the stone promenade in silver-black pools, while the lamps along the quay trembled gently in the rain-darkened tide below. Elias eventually left the ferry shelter and crossed towards the Saltwind Inn. Warm amber light spilled through the rain-streaked windows. Inside, the inn carried that unmistakable feeling certain places acquire during bad weather. Part refuge, part living room, part memory. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp coats, polished oak and slow-cooked stew. Near the fireplace, several harbour workers sat quietly nursing pints, while rain ticked steadily against the old glass panes beside them. Somewhere deeper in the inn, crockery clinked softly, and someone laughed at a joke that had probably been told many times before. Noel looked up from behind the bar as Elias entered. "Thought the marshes had swallowed you." "Not tonight." "That's good. You've still got a tab running." Elias removed his damp coat and settled at the corner table beside the window. From there, he could see almost the entire harbour through the rain-blurred glass. Boats rocking gently, mist drifting above the estuary, and very faintly in the far distance, the warm turning glow of the Gull Point lantern. Noel arrived carrying a bowl of stew and thick bread without being asked. "You look like someone who forgot about supper," he said. "I may have done. Harbour weather does that to people." The stew smelled richly of herbs, onions and slow-cooked beef. Outside, rain swept harder across the promenade. A couple hurried past beneath one umbrella, laughing as the wind caught it sideways. Noel leaned slightly against the table. "Rose, keeping the lantern lit again?" "Yes." The landlord nodded once. "Good. You approve?" "Course I do." Noel glanced towards the estuary. "Some lights are useful beyond practical reasons." Elias looked at him carefully. "You all speak about the lantern as if it's something more than navigation." "It is." Before Elias could ask further, the inn door opened and a rush of cool, rain-scented air entered with Nora Bellamy. She carried a folded umbrella and immediately crossed towards the fireplace. "Hopeless evening for drying washing," she announced. "That's your first concern?" Noel asked. "It's an important concern." The harbour workers near the fire murmured agreement. Nora spotted Elias and wandered over carrying a mug of tea. "Still thinking about the lantern?" "A little. You're supposed to." She settled into the chair opposite him. Rainwater slid slowly down the inn windows beside them. The fire crackled softly. Beyond the bar, someone began turning pages of an old newspaper with exaggerated seriousness. For a while, the inn simply existed around them in comfortable silence. Then Nora spoke quietly. "Years ago, before the bridge, before half the harbour emptied out, people used to leave lights burning for each other all the time." Elias listened. Lanterns in windows, lamps on the pier, even candles during fog. She smiled faintly. The estuary could become a very lonely place in bad weather. And now? Now everyone assumes there'll always be electricity somewhere. The fire shifted softly in the grate. Outside, thunder rolled faintly far beyond the outer marshes. Not sharp, just distant enough to sound sleepy. Nora looked towards the rain-darkened harbour. "Rose says people underestimate how comforting a small light can be." Elias followed her gaze. Out there, somewhere beyond the rain, beyond the tide water and mist, the old Gull Point lantern continued turning patiently through the darkness, warm, steady, unhurried, a quiet promise that someone remained awake beside the estuary. The inn door opened once more. This time an elderly man entered carrying a violin case protected carefully beneath his coat. Several people looked up immediately. "Evening, Arthur," Noel called. Arthur nodded towards the room. "Too wet for sensible activities tonight. That's never stopped you before." The old violinist smiled slightly and moved towards the fireplace. Within minutes, soft music drifted gently through the inn. Not performance music, not polished. Just slow, warm melodies, moving quietly beneath the sound of rain against the windows. Conversation lowered naturally around it. The harbour workers relaxed deeper into their chairs. Someone dimmed the lamp slightly. Elias sat beside the rain-streaked glass, listening to the violin, the fire, the weather, and the low breathing rhythm of Blackwater Harbour settling into another long summer night beside the tide. And somewhere beyond the misted estuary, the lantern at Gull Point continued burning steadily for anyone still wandering home through the rain. Chapter 11. The rain finally eased some time after midnight. By then, only a handful of people remained inside the Saltwind Inn. The fire had burned lower in the grate, the violin music had faded into silence, and the harbour beyond the windows lay wrapped in drifting silver mist beneath the slow-turning tide. Elias stepped outside beneath the awning. The air felt cooler now, fresh after rain. Water still dripped steadily from rooftops and harbour chains, but the storm itself had moved eastward beyond the marshes. Blackwater Harbour had entered that strange, peaceful hour that belongs only to coastal towns after midnight. The hour when footsteps echo farther, when lamps seem softer, when even the sea sounds tired. Elias stood quietly for a moment, looking across the estuary. The Gull Point lantern still glowed faintly in the distance. Not bright enough to dominate the darkness, only enough to accompany it. Noel emerged beside him, carrying a lantern of his own. A simple brass storm lamp with fogged glass and weather-darkened metal. "You heading back?" the landlord asked. "In a while." Noel lit the lamp carefully and hung it beside the inn door. Warm gold light spread across the wet stone beneath the awning. "My father used to leave this out on rainy nights," he said. "For customers? For anyone." The lamp flame fluttered softly inside the glass. Noel adjusted the wick slightly. "Strange thing about harbours," he continued. "People arrive carrying all sorts of things they never speak about." Elias looked towards the quiet tidewater. "And leave without them?" "Sometimes." Rainwater trickled slowly along the harbour gutter beside them. Far out across the estuary, fog drifted low over Greywater Marsh in pale ribbons. Then, through the silence, came the distant sound of an engine. Very faint. Elias frowned slightly and stepped farther from beneath the awning. The sound came again. Small boat engine, slow-moving, out near the outer marsh channel. Noel heard it too. "That'll be Daniel Pike," he said quietly. "Who?" "Crab fisherman, stubborn man. Goes out in weather sensible people avoid." The engine sound drifted unevenly through the mist, then disappeared, then returned again slightly farther south. Elias looked towards the Gull Point lantern. The warm beam continued turning steadily across the fog. Noel folded his arms. "See? See what?" "Why Rose lights it." For a few moments they both listened carefully. Nothing now except tidewater and distant dripping rain. Then finally, the engine sound strengthened slightly. Closer this time, steadier. A few minutes later, through the drifting mist near the harbour mouth, a small fishing boat appeared, carrying weak deck lights shimmering across the dark water. Slowly, carefully, it moved towards the harbour channel. The Gull Point lantern turned once across the fog behind it. Daniel Pike raised one hand briefly from the wheelhouse as he passed. Noel lifted his own hand in return. Then the boat continued safely into harbour. The estuary fell quiet again. Noel looked towards Elias. People think old lights stop mattering because newer things exist. He nodded towards the disappearing boat. But sometimes a warm lantern in bad weather still does exactly what it always did. Elias watched the harbour water shifting softly beneath the lamps. The fishing boat was already tying up along the quay now, its engine finally silent. Far across the marshes, the lantern still burned, keeping company with the tide, with the rain-darkened estuary, with anyone still awake beneath the drifting summer fog. After a while, Noel returned inside the inn, but Elias remained beside the harbour wall a little longer. The air smelled of wet rope, salt water, wood smoke, and rain cooling on stone. Above him, clouds were beginning to break apart at last. A few faint stars appeared between them. He looked once more towards Gull Point. Then quietly, almost without realizing it, Elias smiled, because for the first time in many years, he no longer felt as though he was simply passing through Blackwater Harbour. He felt expected there, and somewhere out across the sleeping estuary. The old lantern continued burning softly beneath the clearing summer sky. Chapter 12. The following evening arrived clear and still. After days of rain and mist, Blackwater Harbour seemed to breathe differently beneath the calm summer sky. The estuary reflected long bands of gold and pale blue, while the final sunlight drifted slowly across the marsh water beyond Gull Point. Elias walked the harbour promenade just before dusk. Everything carried that washed-clean feeling that sometimes follows long weather. Harbour ropes dried slowly against the quay. Windows stood open above the waterfront cafes. Flower boxes along the railings stirred gently in the breeze, coming inland from the tide. And for once, the gulls were quiet. At the far end of the harbour wall, Finn sat swinging his legs above the water while eating chips from newspaper. "You missed the rain," he announced as Elias approached. "I heard rumours there was some." Finn pointed across the estuary. "No lantern tonight, probably." "Because the weather's clear." "Rose says lights matter most when people lose their way." The evening tide moved softly below them. Boats rocked lazily against their ropes while the harbour lamps waited unlit for darkness to arrive. Elias leaned against the warm stone railings and looked out across Blackwater Harbour. It no longer felt temporary to him. That surprised him slightly. Only days earlier he had walked these same paths like a visitor, carrying the invisible restlessness of someone always preparing to leave again. But now the harbour had begun settling around him quietly, in small ways, in unnoticed ways. The warmth of the salt wind in windows during rain, the sound of buoy bells drifting through mist, tea shared beneath shelter roofs, shortbread left beside marsh paths, the steady turning glow of the Gull Point lantern. All the small, quiet kindnesses that belong to places where people still noticed weather and one another. Finn finished the last chip thoughtfully. "You staying then?" he asked. Elias smiled faintly. "Seems possible." "Told you." "You did no such thing." "I implied it." The harbour lamps flickered on one by one behind them. Warm reflections spread slowly across the darkening tide water. Far out beyond the estuary mouth, the main lighthouse beam began its slow evening turn across the open sea. But Gull Point remained dark tonight. No lantern necessary. No rain moving across the marshes. No lost boats feeling their way home through fog. Just a calm summer evening settling gently over Blackwater Harbour. Finn eventually wandered off towards the inn, leaving Elias alone beside the tide. The sky deepened gradually from gold to blue, to the soft, dark colour that arrives just before the first stars appear. Somewhere nearby, a radio played quietly through an open upstairs window. Glasses clinked faintly from the harbour inn. Water moved steadily against the old stone wall below. Elias remained there, listening, not thinking very much, simply listening to the harbour, to the tide, to the peaceful, ordinary life unfolding around him beneath the slow arrival of night. And after a while he realized something quietly important. For years he had spent his life searching for places that felt restful. But perhaps rest had never truly been about places at all. Perhaps it had always been about finding people who left lanterns burning in bad weather. Across the estuary, darkness settled softly over Greywater Marsh. The last colour faded from the sky, and one by one the stars appeared above Blackwater Harbour, while warm summer air drifted gently in from the sea. Elias stayed beside the railings until the harbour grew almost completely still around him. Then at last he turned and walked slowly home through the quiet evening lights, while somewhere far beyond the sleeping marshes, the tide continued rising patiently beneath the stars.